So this next session we've titled Special Forces in the Mediterranean. In this, we'll hear about the pivotal role of Allied Special Forces in the Mediterranean theater, North Africa, Tunisia, Sicily, rugged hills of Italy, and eventually into the beaches of Southern Europe. For this session, I'm not Dr. Alan Millett. I'm filling in for Alan, and we're joined by two very talented authors who are closely connected to their subject matter. So I think this will be another great session. You know, Dr. David Williams is a former Army armor officer. Love that. Lumber industry executive. This is a very eclectic panel. With a PhD in wood science from Colorado State University. I had to include that. He is the president of the Descendants of World War II Rangers Incorporated, and today he'll share the story of Darby's Rangers that he's drawn over several decades of interviews. His book, The Road to Cisterna, chronicles the heroism and heavy sacrifice of the Darby's Rangers. Also with us, Todd Ross, a historian, a writer who's committed to bringing the past to life. He also is a wine connoisseur and retailer, and features wine travel and other pretty amazing talents. But he's published several works on U.S. Special Operations units in action during World War II. He's worked as a consultant for the History Channel and the Canadian History Channel, and his work, The Super Commandos, is widely respected. In it, he explores the daring exploits of the 1st Special Service Force, an elite American-Canadian unit. So we'll turn the podium over to David, and we'll continue mission. David?
Dr. Mueller, Mr. Hilliard, trustees, ladies and gentlemen, this is a huge honor. My book has only been out 8 weeks. Never expected this kind of attention to the book so fast. This morning we heard about Len Lamel in the 2nd Ranger Battalion at Pointe du Hoc. Those are not the Rangers I'm going to talk about. We heard about the 5th Ranger Battalion at Omaha Beach. I know Major General John Ron very well. We just presented him with the Congressional Gold Medal for the World War II Rangers. He's 103. He's sharp as a tack. General Ron is the last surviving Ranger who landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. So, I don't get to see them. I don't want to advance them, but have to go back. That's okay. So the title of my book is The Road to Cisterna, Darby's Rangers, and their most consequential battle in World War II. So what's that about? Well, the road to Cisterna implies the long road from the time Darby's Rangers were formed in 1942 until their demise when they were all wiped out at the Battle of Cisterna in 1944. So Darby was William Orlando Darby. He was a native of Fort Smith, Arkansas, and he was a West Point graduate. As a young captain, he was picked to command the 1st Ranger Battalion. So what is Cisterna? Well, that's where the battle was fought, and that was a climactic battle. So the last book, that talked about Darby's Rangers was Ranger Force, published 16 years ago. A huge difference in that book and mine is that I interviewed Rangers over 2 decades. I got to know many of them. I got their stories, their memorabilia, their letters. Most of all, I got to know them. And they shared stories with me that perhaps they would not have shared with anybody else. My book has 12 battle maps in it, all drawn to scale using Google Earth. There are no other maps like that in any other book. So my book is different because most history books are told from the top down by the commanders or by historians. My book is told by the men who did the fighting, told by privates, corporals, and sergeants, and a few officers. So how did the book come to be? There it is. So this is my uncle, Colonel James B. Lyle. He's the only Ranger who's been inducted to both the Infantry OCS Hall of Fame and the U.S. Army Ranger Hall of Fame. My story began when I was 7 years old. October 1950, he was executive officer in the 187th Regimental Combat Team, known as the Rakkasans. They parachuted behind the North Korean lines to try to capture the government and bring an early end to the war. His parachute fouled, and he had about 2 seconds to realize what to do. He popped his reserve chute and it opened just as he hit the ground. He survived the fall and spent 2 years in Army hospital with broken bones. Had it not been for his World War II record, the Army would have retired him. But they told him that as long as he could pass the PT test annually, he could stay on active duty, and he served a distinguished 30 years. He'd never spoken to anybody about his time in the Rangers until I was on active duty, and then he picked me to talk to. We talked a lot for 15 years, and when he passed away, nope, I gotta go back. It's not working. Here. I'm sorry. I'm supposed to be seeing what's going on. Okay. It's not advancing. All right, so I went to a meeting of the Ranger Battalions Association in World War II, and I met Warren Evans. He had been Darby Sergeant Major. They called him Bing because he could sing like Bing Crosby, and he took me under wing and introduced me to a lot of these people. I met tons of Rangers, and over 2 decades, I got to interview them. The first reunion that I chaired was right here in New Orleans. It was first day was 9/11/2001. Bing, during a planning meeting, Bing took me aside. He put his hand on my shoulders and he said, "Never let this die." We met here on that Friday. I believe it was September 14. We had our memorial service right here at the then D-Day Museum. We were downstairs in the big room with the Higgins boat. It was quite an event. Bing wrote the foreword for my book, but then he died before it could be finished. What I learned from him and from the other Rangers was not a day would go by that they would not remember their time being a Ranger. So this slide shows the time frame for my book. You know about Pearl Harbor. You know about D-Day at Normandy. There's about a 2-year period in between. Perhaps not much is known. We're fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, but during this 2-year period, the Army needed to build plants, machines, tanks, planes, recruit troops, and train them. So General George Marshall, who was Chief of Staff, wanted a unit much like the British Commandos, who could go deep behind enemy lines, who could spearhead landings on enemy shores. The Rangers were activated on June the 19th, 1942 in Northern Ireland and trained by British commandos. The requirements were tough. The Rangers had to learn how to speed march 50% faster than a normal regular infantry unit. Rangers had to be able to move far and fast. Candidates were asked such questions as, can you stick a knife in a man and twist it? Over 2,000 applied, 480 were accepted. Their first action was the Dieppe raid on the coast of France. 6,000 British and Canadian commandos attacked to find out if we were ready to cross the English Channel and attack the Germans. The answer was we were not. It was a fiasco. 70% casualties among the commandos. 3 Rangers were killed. Including Second Lieutenant Edward Lustelot, the first American soldier killed on the European continent. Lieutenant Lustelot was a graduate at LSU. He was an architect student. He was from Franklin, Louisiana, a Louisiana native. His unit had been called to England, to Northern Ireland, right away, and he volunteered. First American soldier killed. Many texts have named him Edwin. The lieutenant's name was Edward. I correct several mistakes in my book because when I wrote this book, years after most of them were written, we had access to better data. We had information from the National Archives and also had the Rangers' own stories. Counting Dieppe, Darby's Rangers invaded 5 enemy shores during World War II. Almost to a man, the Rangers said the most frightening thing they did was to invade an enemy shore at night that was defended under fire. So the next slide shows Arzu. That's in North Africa. And after that, the Rangers went into Tunisia. Upon arrival in Tunisia, the 1st Ranger Battalion pulled a night raid on Sined Station. You heard something about that this morning. 3 companies attacked before daylight with knives and grenades. Bing Evans was leading his platoon. He froze on the trigger. Can you imagine an enemy soldier rushing at you with his rifle leveled, a long bayonet flashing in the dark? Bing said that soldier's eyes were big as saucers. He didn't know what happened, but all of a sudden he couldn't move. His little runner, Tommy Sullivan, shot the enemy soldier. Bing called that the vacuum. Years later, Bing was watching Saving Private Ryan, and when he saw the actor Captain Miller in the surf trying to hide behind a tetrahedron, the movie went silent. Bing blurted out, "The vacuum." And then he apologized to people sitting around him. He said he believed that there was some factor, a stress factor, that caused soldiers to freeze up. And Bing always believed that that's when a lot of casualties occurred. You never heard about it because they became casualties. From there, they went into Tunisia. That was the field of very, very heavy fighting. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the American Army was being overrun. Major General Terry Allen, who commanded the 1st Infantry Division, sent an order to Colonel Darby, and these orders have been written up in a number of books. He requested a reinforced Ranger company with a hairy-chested commander, ladies, with big nuts. No one ever identified who the captain was. My uncle was a hairy-chested commander. When he passed away, the orders were in his briefcase. Going into Sicily next, Sicily was known as Operation Husky. That was the 7th Army under the command of George Patton. You can see from the map the proximity of Sicily to Italy. It was important to have Sicily because we needed the air bases so we could bomb or strafe Italy and return. In that day and time, you couldn't fly all the way from Tunisia or anywhere in North Africa to Italy and return. So for that reason, we had to have Sicily. At the time, they had over 300,000 Italian and German soldiers there. The night before, there was a huge storm. The seas were very, very rough. Sergeant Ted Fleeser was in one of those landing craft. It was a Higgins boat. As they crested a wave, enemy searchlights would pick up the boat and discover them. Before the enemy could open fire, the boat dropped into the next trough, so they couldn't be hit. As always, the Rangers were first ashore, with much intense fighting for the first few days. There are numerous stories of bravery that I tell about Sicily. Perhaps the bravest of all was one about the bakery. The women of Gela, Sicily, had no bakery. Colonel Darby's men had captured the bakery so the army would have bread. The women protested loudly. Nothing happened. 2 days later, hundreds of women from Gela packed themselves together on the street, across the street from the bakery, and they attacked. The two Rangers fled. The Battle of the Bakery was in the books. All right, so I got messed up here. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. It doesn't want to go back. Okay, so from there they went from Sicily into Salerno. That was the first American invasion on the Italian continent. When they landed at Salerno, they landed at a place called Maori, and the Rangers went up to a high peak called Chunzi Mountain. And from there, the Rangers could look down on the Germans on the backside, and if the Germans looked up, they were looking at Rangers on the top. Private William Fox knew that they needed intelligence, and he volunteered to go on a mission solo down the mountain by himself to collect the information. Permission denied, it was too dangerous. So one night, he went by himself. He found a house, slipped into some clothes. He found a girl. Nobody ever found out where. She took him to the Italian officers' quarters, and he convinced an Italian lieutenant to come back up the mountain with him to show the Allied intelligence where the German facilities were located. He told him he was an officer, and he promised that if the lieutenant would come back up to the top of the mountain with him, that the Allies would no longer bombard their cities. They got back to the top. Fox was arrested for disobeying an order. His company commander realized how important the intelligence was, began writing him up for a Silver Star. Colonel Darby heard about that. He said, no, we're giving the man a Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Fox went back to Italy after the war, found the girl, married her, and he lived there the rest of his life. From there, the Germans went into Venafro in the mountains. Very heavy fighting in the middle of the winter, November and December 1943. During that time in the mountains, I already mentioned Lester Kness. I'll tell a story about him I hadn't planned to tell. But Captain Kness commanded A Company in the 4th Ranger Battalion. In one action, they were trying to capture a high point to use for an observation post. As Kness was directing the traffic with his men, he ran around the knoll. There was a dead German lying there, and he remembered what a commando sergeant had told him: never trust a dead German. Kness wheeled around. As he did, the German was rising up to fire. Kness fired first. From there, we went into Anzio. It was a short fight for the Rangers because they were defeated, but it was a long battle for the Americans. And you'll hear more about that later. But now Darby commanded a unit almost the size of a regiment. The plan was to invade Anzio and capture the Germans, trap the Germans south of Anzio between there and Cassino, wipe out the German army, and then move into Rome. General Lucas was the corps commander, and he was concerned that all of the American units were being siphoned off to Normandy, and he was afraid he wouldn't have enough troops to go ahead and go into Rome by himself. So they said he was timid. I'm not sure he was timid. There was a lot of discussion about that. But while he and General Mark Clark, who was the American commander, discussed over an 8-day period what to do, the Germans reinforced. General Clark said, we need to capture Cisterna. It was high ground, would be a great point of observation. Also, the main railroad line ran through Cisterna, along with 2 of the highways. So now I can advance it. So this is one of my maps, and I know you can't read this much detail from the back of the room, but I simply want you to see this is one of 12 maps in my book, drawn to scale. It shows the town of Cisterna, 2 major roads. There's a triangular area where the battle is fought. It's about 3/4 of a mile long on each side. The Rangers are all huddled along the road at the top. This is early in the morning, about 7 o'clock, 7:40. The Rangers are scattered all over this field, being cut to pieces by German tanks. And the tanks are the little black dots, if that's all you can see from the back. The Rangers claim that they destroyed 19 tanks, so I showed 19 tanks or tracked vehicles. Some of the Rangers had just joined, and they were so new to the Army, they couldn't recognize different type of tracked vehicles in the dark, so they just called them all tanks, though some of them might have been personnel carriers or such. A major goal of my book was to better tell the Battle of the Cisterna in detail, by the clock. I believed I could do that because I'd taken the stories of men who fought there. Most of these stories had never been told. Here's a brief summary of the battle. The 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions, 769 men, led off on the mission one night just after midnight, marching under radio silence, 15 feet apart, in a column that stretched over a mile long, marching through a series of ditches and canals. They were muddy and sloppy. It had been raining. It was freezing cold. The idea was to reach Cisterna before daylight so they could be reinforced. Once there, the 4th Ranger Battalion, who was attacking from the south, was to reinforce them, along with the 1st and 15th Infantry Regiments, who were also attacking in the same area. However, when the 1st and 3rd Rangers came out of the ditch, they found themselves on flat ground, 800 yards south of Cisterna. They were in the middle of a German bivouac. There were German soldiers sleeping on the ground, sleeping in foxholes. Major Jack Dobson was the commander. They were under radio silence. He had no orders of what to do except capture Cisterna. He couldn't reach Darby by radio, so he ordered an attack. He told the men, draw your knives, get grenades, go to work. And they did. Things didn't turn out as planned. In most military books, the Cisterna battle gets a very few pages of coverage and is told from the top down by a historian. In my book, the battle is told in 72 pages by more than 40 Rangers who fought there that day. No one has ever previously told the story in such detail. When the battle was over and the men were captured, over 600 were captured. The day after the battle, the Germans paraded them around Rome through the streets. The map on the left shows the Colosseum at the bottom right-hand side. That's where trucks unloaded the Rangers, and they were paraded through Rome, through the old part of town. It was about a 2-mile march. You can see the photograph shows the Rangers being marched, a column about 5 or 6 men wide, German soldiers on each side armed. You see the Colosseum in the distance, so they had just begun the march. This picture, you can see, was creased. It was found in an abandoned German bunker at the end of the war, and as it turns out, it's one of the better pictures we have of that march. Numerous writers claim that the Rangers were ambushed at Cisterna. The Germans claimed to a man, except for one man. They claimed that they were not ambushed. The Rangers say they ambushed the Germans. They know that because they were all asleep when they got there. My book corrects another error. Most writers, going back to right after the war, claim that only 6 men escaped the battle. They were either not killed or captured. The 6 men were never named because writers copied off each other because that's all the information they had. Through our research, we're able to identify 18 men, confirm them through records at the archives. 18 men returned from that battle, and I named these 18 men in my book. Little has been said about the 4th Ranger Battalion, who was attacking from the south. I'm watching the clock, I'm sorry. The 4th Ranger Battalion suffered 50% casualties from the time they landed at Anzio. Every company commander was killed. After the forced march, This is a print by James Dietz. This is his idea of the Battle of Cisterna. Of course, it's heavily watermarked, but you see it's been signed by 24 men. I had their print at the 2001 reunion here in New Orleans, and 24 men who were at that battle signed their name. 18 of those men later gave me their stories for this book. Incredible photograph. I interviewed them. I got their memorabilia, their letters, their records. So one of the rangers, well, several rangers escaped, but Lieutenant William Noonan escaped before he was shipped off to a POW camp. He found his way to Rome, and there he found solace is secured in the French seminary. He stayed there for 3 months while the fighting went on. One morning, he heard heavy firing and a lot of commotion in Rome, and he slipped out of the seminary into the street, and he met soldiers from the 1st Special Service Force who had just come into Rome. He said, "Who's your commander?" And they said, "General Frederick." He said, "Please take me to your commander." So General Frederick put him in a half-track and took him south to 5th Army headquarters where he could be debriefed. On the way, they passed a town that had been totally demolished, nothing left. General Frederick said, "Do you know what this is?" And Lieutenant Noonan said, "I do not." He said, "This is Cisterna." So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I'm glad I could make the connection between the Rangers and the 1st Special Service Force. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Todd Ross, and I'm the author of The Super Commandos. It's the history of the 1st Special Service Force in World War II. Before getting started, I just want to thank the National World War II Museum for having me here today. In 1990, I made my first trip to the National Archives with my twin brother, who was doing research there for college. I thought it would be fun to start doing my own digging in the archives, and since I had just seen the movie The Devil's Brigade, I chose the 1st Special Service Force as my topic. The Devil's Brigade, released in 1968, was a movie based on the 1966 book of the same name, written by George Walton and Robert Adelman. They'd styled their book, in my opinion, after an earlier novel by E.M. Nathanson, The Dirty Dozen. Like Nathanson, Walton and Adelman hoped to sell their book to Hollywood and get rich. So in writing it, there was no service to history in mind. Rather, they adhered closely to the mantra, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. But who were the real Devil's Brigade? Once I start pulling threads and chasing leads, the research became something of an obsession for me, and the 1st Special Service Force became my mad hobby. I spent the rest of the decade interviewing, corresponding with, and getting to know the veterans of the force, and digging in private and military archives around the United States, Canada, and France. What I immediately learned was that the 1st Special Service Force was not at all like the Dirty Dozen, nor was it a misfit unit of Canadian regulars welded to an unruly mob of Yanks deposited from U.S. Army stockades, as the Devil's Brigade would have one believe. Yet where Walton and Adelman and Hollywood got it right was that the 1st Special Service Force was indeed raised for a suicide mission. The story of the 1st Special Service Force began in the shop of the British Combined Operations led by Lord Louis Mountbatten, protege of Winston Churchill, organizer of what became the British Commandos. On Mountbatten's staff, there was a civilian scientist named Geoffrey Pike, who in 1942 proposed a daring plan to raise and equip a force of men to wage war successfully over snow during the upcoming European winter. It was called Operation Plow, and it envisioned a revolutionary snow machine yet to be designed that would provide the means. Mountbatten had secured participation for the scheme by both the United States Army and the Canadian Department of National Defense, so Operation Plow would become a joint U.S.-Canadian effort, and both nations would provide combat troops for the Plow force equally. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Frederick, who was then serving on the staff of the War Plans Division of the War Department, was put in command. The call for volunteers for hazardous duty, or as the Canadians called it, a hardship unit, went out to both armies. Because Plow Force would be raised with one mission in mind, it would be a force like no other. The unit would be sent to operate independently behind enemy lines with no possibility for support and without the possibility of relief. Frederick needed men who were already trained soldiers, but more than that, he needed rugged individualists, men who were tough physically and mentally, men who could not only cope in cold, arduous conditions, but who would thrive in them. While the force wanted tough outdoors types, what it got, no matter their backgrounds, were men of action, eager to do their part in the war and to get into the fight and strike a blow against the enemy. Generally, they were older men. Their average age was 26 years old. A number of the Canadians had already seen combat on the European continent. The search for an ideal training camp ended at Fort William Henry Harrison, a remote former National Guard post outside of Helena, Montana. It was close to the Continental Divide, making it a perfect location for winter and mountain warfare exercises, and it had its own airfield for parachute training. Operation Plow listed 3 possible targets: the High-Head electrical power facilities in Italy's Po Valley, the Romanian oil fields at Ploesti, and the third was the hydroelectric and heavy water production facilities in Norway. Therefore, Plow Force would be organized into 3 separate regiments of about 400 men apiece and deployed when the time came to one of those 3 objectives. Later, as planning progressed, Italy and Romania were struck from the target list, and Norway became the sole target. Development of an all-new snow vehicle for the Plow Force, what would become the T-15 Weasel, was proceeding rapidly, with Studebaker's promise that the required 600 vehicles would be ready by fall of 1942. As time was short, Frederick split his unit into 2 parts, a combat echelon and a service battalion. The men of the combat echelon, the force's 3 regiments, would do nothing but train, while the service battalion personnel would carry out support functions. By the fall of 1942, the Plow Force, now officially known as the 1st Special Service Force, had been shaped into an elite infantry unit, physically fit, trained parachutists, skiers, winter warfare specialists, mountaineers, sabotage experts, experts in the use of demolitions, hand-to-hand combat, small arms, enemy small arms, raiding tactics, and the use and maintenance of their snow vehicles. However, problems that would prove Operation Plow's undoing began to reveal themselves. Sufficient air transport for the Weasels was not forthcoming. A means of withdrawal, or more aptly put, escape, of the Plow Force from the combat area remained undetermined, and in fact, none had ever been worked out. The final strike against Plow occurred when the Norwegian government suddenly withdrew its support, reasoning that the destruction of the power plants would cause more harm to the civilian population that winter than help the war effort. So in September 1942, as the organization and training of the unit began to mature, the plan for which it was conceived was canceled. Colonel Frederick, who had proven himself an energetic and competent and an imaginative leader, when faced with the possible dissolution of the unit he'd worked tirelessly to raise, lobbied the War Department to keep the force intact and to find it a new mission. In the meantime, Frederick set about reorganizing the force into a nimble, hard-hitting assault infantry unit. The force's manpower strength was increased and its organic offensive firepower as well. To its skill set was added training in amphibious assault from rubber boats. By the time it had completed its training in mid-1943, the 1st Special Service Force was arguably the most capable light infantry unit in the world. The force's first chance at action came in August 1943 when it was sent to the Aleutians to spearhead a task force whose mission was to retake Kiska Island from the Japanese. Though the force had performed well, landing by rubber boat at night and advancing inland to secure both a beachhead and critical features of terrain, the Japanese had escaped days before and the victory was bloodless. Now the force was sent to Italy, where it arrived in November 1943, went into bivouac, and immediately began reconditioning after more than 2 months of transit from the Pacific to the European Theater of Operations and to General Mark Clark's United States Fifth Army. While the force had been offered to Clark, noting its mountaineering and reconnaissance abilities, as well as its extremely high morale, Clark, who eagerly accepted them, was simply desperate for troops. At this moment, Clark's forces were battling a deeply entrenched German army in what was called the Bernhard Line, also known as the Winter Line, the mountains that guarded the entry to the Leary Valley, the Mignano Gap, south of Cassino and the Rapido River, and guarding the main highway corridor north to Rome. The battle conditions were horrible: snow, cold rains, deep mud, desolate mountain peaks defended by a tenacious enemy. In futile frontal assaults, Clark's forces had been attacking for weeks and getting virtually nowhere. With D-Day set for December 3rd, the force would finally get their chance to face the enemy as part of Operation Raincoat. Raincoat would be a coordinated attack against the Camino Maggiore hill mass that stood like the left-hand gatepost overlooking the Mignano Gap. The linchpin of this hill mass was Hill 960, Monte La Defensa, a 3,150-foot high volcanic dome with German troops dug in on its summit and their artillery observers, machine guns, and mortars sighted along all conceivable avenues of approach. After careful reconnaissance of the hill by Frederick and the force's 2nd Regiment commanders, who would lead the assault on D-Day, a plan was devised that would utilize the unit's unique strengths. Frontal assault was futile, but the force had found another way. On the night of D-1, forcemen of the 2nd Regiment moved from bivouac and marched, cloaked by darkness, to a position on the mountain under the cover of trees 2/3 up the slope of Hill 960, and there spent the ensuing day silently undiscovered by the enemy observation. As night descended, once again, the forcemen, heavily burdened by weapons, ammunition, and water and rations, made their way around to the north side of the mountain to the base of a 100-foot escarpment that led to the back door of the enemy position. While Corps artillery pounded the forward slopes of Hill 960 in a diversionary attack, chosen force scouts free-climbed the steep slope and then secured ropes for the 3 companies of 1st Battalion, 2nd Regiment, who would scale the cliff and lead the assault in. 1st Company was up and in position, and 2nd Company was maneuvering into position when the Germans finally came alive and the battle began. With the element of surprise in their favor, though, the 1st Special Service Force used their tremendous speed and firepower to overwhelm the defenders, and by 5 a.m., the force held the summit. And at that moment, the force's role as special forces had ended, at least for the moment. What then began was a 45-day odyssey, a battle of attrition throughout the mountains west, then east of the Mignano Gap, involving all 3 regiments of the force and its service battalion personnel, across bald, rocky slopes and defiles, bombed-out villages, and barren, muddy tracks. Having entered the Winter Line on December 2nd with approximately 1,800 men in its combat echelon, the force that left the mountains on January 17th had been whittled away to just over 300 men. It had been an unbelievable test of endurance and an equally dogged show of determination against what in terms of World War II combat was considered catastrophic losses. For the rest of January 1944, and for some time beyond, it was planned that the force would rebuild and recover, but an emergency at Anzio changed the script. An Anglo-American landing had, as we know, been made at Anzio on 22 January 1944, with the hope of causing either a withdrawal of German forces from their positions around Cassino, or at least a weakening of those positions enough to facilitate an Allied breakthrough. Neither had happened. Instead, what had developed was a crisis at Anzio as German forces had clamped down tightly on the beachhead and had threatened to drive it into the sea. So with few reserves at hand, the 1st Special Service Force was rushed to Anzio. The force that landed at Naples Harbor in 1943 and that which landed at Anzio on February 1st, 1944 were two different units. Losses of the force's combat echelon, losses in the echelon, had been slow to be made up. Forcemen returning from hospital, some still recovering from wounds, retook their position in the line. Replacements, though all volunteers, were not of the same caliber as the original forcemen. Nevertheless, the unit undertook to train them as quickly and as thoroughly as possible in force doctrine. In fact, there had been a question as to whether its Canadian losses would be made up at all, and if those Canadians that remained should be withdrawn and sent as replacements to other of their units in the field. For the time being, however, sentiment to preserve Canadian presence within the force prevailed, and a small number of Canadian volunteer replacements were infused. By early February, the force was set up along the interior berm of the Mussolini Canal, with its position dug into the bank that had been created by the spoils. 1st Regiment was on the right, holding 5 kilometers of the MLR, and 3rd Regiment on the left, holding 8 kilometers more. To its left was the U.S. 4th Ranger Battalion, and then the U.S. 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. 2nd Regiment, 1st Special Service Force, was held in force reserve and was thus free to conduct aggressive patrolling. The German outpost line was just on the other side of the canal. The terrain was flat as a pancake, and the whole area was under German observation. Any movement during daylight risked direct fire. This was an arrangement that the forcemen quickly found intolerable. With its capacity for offensive operations low, at Anzio, the force's role as assault infantry would change yet again to one of defenders. But the force would wage an aggressive defense. Since movement during the day was impossible, the forcemen would use the night as a shield and thus would give rise to the legend of the Black Devils. Not so long after the force's nighttime activities began, it was reported that a force patrol recovered a diary from the body of a dead German lieutenant. An entry from the February 11th stated, "Reports from Sassuno of Black Devil raid last night. We never hear these devils when they come." The diary and its contents soon became common knowledge on the beachhead, and the Black Devil's nickname became forever linked with the 1st Special Service Force. Throughout its 99 days along the Mussolini Canal, the forcemen blackened their faces and sent out nightly combat trolls to harass and push back the enemy. As part of their tactics, they left behind calling cards, stickers on the enemies that they killed that read, "The worst is yet to come." But make no mistake, there was no patrol that did not come back without casualties, because the Germans most often gave as good as they got. During its time on the front lines at Anzio, the force, while holding a full 1/4 of the beachhead's frontage, what would normally have been allocated to a division, effectively pushed the German outpost line back a full mile from the Mussolini Canal. On May 9th, the 1st Special Service Force was relieved of its frontline position and went to the rear to prepare for the long-awaited breakout of the Anzio beachhead, codenamed Operation Buffalo. This would be an attack timed to support Operation Diadem, a massive all-out assault against German forces at Cassino. By now, the ranks of the force had been rebuilt. It had swollen to 2,744 officers and men, including more than 450 Darby's Rangers, predominantly from the 4th Battalion, who were transferred in beginning in March. The Anzio breakout commenced on May 23rd, with the force going over the top in a World War I style attack that saw it locked in a brutal day-long back-and-forth melee with German infantry, tanks, and artillery. The savage fighting continued through the next day as well, but by May 25th, the German forces began backing towards Rome, with the Allies in close pursuit. In the attack, the force's mission was to protect the assault's right flank and drive north, capturing terrain features along the Velletri Gap with the objective of Valmontone on the German route of retreat from the south along Highway 6. German resistance was particularly bitter at Artina, where the enemy attempted to keep the escape corridor open as long as possible. But by June 3rd, the German defenses were collapsing, prompting orders for the force to shift direction and launch an attack westward toward Rome. Fifth Army Commander Mark Clark was hungry to grab the headline in honor of capturing the first of the Axis capitals, as well as lead the First Army to capture Rome from the south in 15 centuries. In this effort, the force would have one final important mission: to capture the 6 bridges across the Tiber River in Rome above Northing 68 on their AMS maps. Doing so would allow the Allied Army to continue its pursuit of the enemy north of Rome. By the end of June 4th, the force had held 8 bridges, and Rome was firmly in Allied hands. After the capture of Rome, the force was relieved and began training and rehabilitation for future missions. It was during this time that now General Frederick was reassigned to command 1st Airborne Task Force for the invasion of southern France. Command of the force passed to Colonel Ted Walker, formerly of 3rd Regiment. From a new base in Castellabate, Italy, the force practiced rubber boat assaults, night maneuvers, landing on cliffy shores, and working with naval beach marking parties and shore fire control parties. The force would be spearheading the upcoming invasion of southern France, Operation Dragoon. In the invasion, the force would once again carry out a mission indicative of its earlier training. On the eve of the main landings, it would rubber boat ashore Ile de Port Croix and Ile de Levant, destroy the enemy garrisons and destroy a suspected enemy gun battery on the eastern tip of Ile de Levant that threatened the western approach to the landing area on the coast. By the evening of D-Day, Ile de Levant had been reduced by the force's 2nd and 3rd Regiments, but on Port Croix it took 2 additional days of fighting and fire from a British battleship for 1st Regiment to pry the last of the German defenders from a Napoleonic-era fortress. The force was then moved to the mainland, where it took up the pursuit of the Germans east along the Côte d'Azur toward the Franco-Italian border and the Maritime Alps, reaching it approximately 3 weeks later, where it took up defensive positions. For the force, it was no champagne campaign, as it traded blows all the way with a still very capable and deadly enemy. Relieved in place on November 28th, the force was moved to a new bivouac in Villeneuve-Loubet, and there received word it was to be disbanded. On December 5th, 1944, almost 1 year to the day after the 1st Special Service Force entered combat in Europe, the unit was no more. Canadian men and officers, 620 in all, fell out of ranks and were soon aboard trucks taking them to Marseille and ships bound for Naples, then England and beyond. 350 U.S. personnel were transferred to the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. The rest, including former Rangers, were joined by the Norwegian-American 99th Battalion to form the 474th Regiment. Ironically, on May 7, 1945, the 474th was ordered to Norway, where it would oversee the disarming of some 300,000 German troops. The 1st Special Service Force has been known by many names. During the war, it was the Plow Force at first, sometimes mistaken for Special Services troops. Helena newspapers called them the Bow and Arrow Boys and the Super Commandos. The Germans called them the Black-Faced Devils. Later, writers called them the Devil's Brigade. Whatever their name, their combat record speaks for itself. Stan Waters, who served as a major in the force, praised especially the quality of the men, their superb strength and endurance, plus their indomitable spirit and high morale. We could, he said, have been a formidable force had we only been armed with clubs. Thank you.
So let's dive into a couple questions. You know, what we have in both of these, it seems as you have elite special forces with very specialized, unique capabilities, but under commanders that aren't necessarily aware of how they can be used, or because of the challenges in Italy, lack of resources, that are these units ultimately used as essentially just more infantry? As you mentioned, they're covering what would have been a division frontage, but instead are chewed up that way. And so is there a kind of a leadership and doctrinal piece that ultimately ends up in the demise of both of these units, particularly in the Italian campaign, where ultimately, as David, you briefed at Cisterna, you see basically an infantry regiment attack into a fortified village, really without the great intelligence, and then similar challenges, I think, with the 1st Special Service Force. So maybe start with that first, and I'd welcome each of your thoughts on that concept.
Okay, so thanks. So General Truscott, who commanded the 3rd Infantry Division at Cisterna, was criticized by General Clark after the battle. Truscott said it was a proper use of men. The problem was that from the time the Rangers landed on January 22nd until January the 30th, the day of the battle, the Germans reinforced with over 60,000 men. And when daylight came, the Rangers found themselves surrounded, outnumbered 70 to 1. So though they fought all day valiantly, there was no way they could have ever overcome that. So from that standpoint, it was not a misuse by the Rangers. They were just totally misunderstood. The biggest thing I've never been able to resolve was that 3 days before the Cisterna invasion, the 3rd Infantry Division had tried to get to Cisterna on their own, and they had been repulsed. And I cannot understand why their intelligence then would claim that there were only a handful of Germans in the area. I wrestle with that. I'm not sure anybody's alive who knows the answer. But nevertheless, that's what happened.
Yeah, the intel picture is an incredible disconnect.
Yes.
I mean, if you look, I think it's the 15th Regiment that attacks earlier, and how is it the situation is so completely different in theory, but obviously in practice it's moved even the opposite direction.
Yes.
Todd, jump in.
Well, my feeling is this on? My feeling is that units like the 1st Special Service Force, the Rangers, all the Ranger battalions, these units, they do embody this idea of the force multiplier, and I just think the grit of men like this who've been trained so hard and so well, their physical fitness and their mental attitude because of the rigorous weeding out process to find men who are of a like type. I think that's where the units are at they show their best. But I do believe that there's often, what I saw from my research, or what I often see, is there's perhaps one thing, a lack of opportunity to employ them, and then a lack of understanding. There's just such a need. I think during World War II, there was such a need for manpower. It was such a meat grinder that these guys were just thrown in over and over again. Just like the airborne divisions who were supposed to land in Normandy and fight hard, as we've seen in Band of Brothers. They made a bit of a joke out of it. Fight hard for 3 days and then we'd be withdrawn, and then 2 months later or something like that, they were finally withdrawn from the field because they just had no other possibility.
Yeah, you both lay out how these are kind of elite assault forces committed for the initial assault, but then remain in the campaign, for weeks afterwards, and then get ground up. The casualty rates, I think for the audience, it's incredible when you think about, infantry regiments in the ETO are going to have on average 100% casualties in 3 months of combat, but these units even exceed that average.
Yeah.
Maybe you mentioned General Frederick. I believe he has 7 Purple Hearts by the time the war ends. But really a testament to the casualty rates and the need for leaders to continue to lead the soldiers forward. Any comments on casualties? What do you think?
Well, go ahead, Dave.
Okay. Well, at the Battle of Cisterna, we identified only 8 men out of the 400 men in the fight. Actually, 760 men in that fight. It identified only 8 officers who had been trained by the original commandos. All the others were replacements. So what happened is, The commander of the 3rd Battalion was killed in the incursion, so he was dead way before daylight. Major Dobson, who commanded the 1st Ranger Battalion, jumped on the back of a tank early on to throw a grenade down the hatch. There was an explosion. He was seriously injured, so both commanders were knocked out. Apparently, there was a failure to have a chain of command. So we had, in the 3rd Battalion, we had 2 captains who had a fist fight over who should be in command, I think over dates of rank. Just young men.
That sounds like something lieutenants would do, right?
Yeah, but they were young. And in the 1st Battalion, we had 2 men arguing over dates of rank in the middle of the fight. And one man said the other was in charge, the other said the other man was in charge. Neither one was afraid. They were afraid they would be blamed for it. So it was, there was no communication, radio silence, the radios were out. They probably had 75 or 80% men who'd never fought as a unit before, scattered all over this field.
Well, I should note, with that, today we think, okay, of course there's a clear chain of command and things like that, but these are things that, they really have to develop the doctrine, the muscle memory, and these are incredibly young officers at that case,
So what I think that Darby never envisioned something like this would happen. They'd never lost a fight before. And he envisioned that if something happened, he could be reached by radio and he could then tell them what to do. But they were unable to reach him. None of the radios worked. Ground was wet, heavy humidity, and it was just a fiasco.
Todd, jump in about your thought on casualties and leaders.
Well, I know the 1st Special Service Force was an interesting group because even on patrols, rank didn't always come into play as to who would lead the patrol. Usually the most competent man would lead the patrols at night. So that was interesting. They had what was they considered a very loose, easy discipline in the unit. And while certainly the officers were in charge of the organization, these men were all independent. They could think for themselves. They could take action for themselves. And I think in the pinch, when the casualties were so heavy, they still had men who were ready leaders and self-starters. They didn't need to be told what to do to keep moving forward. And that's a comment about the Battle of Monte La Defensa, because you think of the Special Service Force, you say a regiment, a normal infantry regiment, a rifle regiment's 2,100 men, I think, in World War II. The 1st Special Service Force regiment was about 400 men. A company was maybe 70 odd guys. So on top of the mountain, they had 70 men, let's say on the attack on Monte La Defensa, they had 70 men who were in position, 70 more who were moving into position when the battle starts. But they all are trained, they know what to do, and off they go in the attack on the enemy. And as one man said, he said, unless you looked and someone was dead, everyone else was firing their weapons. They were a very aggressive unit, and that had been trained into them. And I think the Rangers were very much the same way. That had been instilled in them from the time they had learned from the commandos at Aknakari.
Well, good. Why don't we open it up to the audience and get some more folks here? And if not, I have more questions to ask these guys.
A round of applause for the panel, ladies and gentlemen. First question's going to be to your right, about halfway back.
Yeah, I have a question about the Rangers who got the drop on the Germans sleeping in the trenches. How exactly did they all get captured if they caught the Germans by surprise?
Question was, I couldn't understand.
How did they all get captured if they caught the Germans sleeping?
How did the Rangers get captured by those Germans when they had the drop on them?
Okay, so the Rangers were asleep on the ground. Dobson told his men, draw your knives, men, there's work to be done. They began running through the bivouac, slicing men's throats. Of course, then the Germans came alive. It took the Germans about 2 hours to realize what was happening. Definitely, the Rangers were not ambushed. They ambushed the Germans. It took the Germans a couple of hours to figure out what was happening, how to react to this, and then my map I showed with the counterattack, the Germans began bringing in tanks and artillery and cutting up the Rangers into little small groups, and that's when they became totally outnumbered.
Yeah. And I think to add to that comment, I was close friends with an original 1st Ranger, Carl Lehman. You know, Carl, they had advanced along this ditch, the Pantano ditch that was from the Rangers' front line into Cisterna, and at night, pitch dark, and they had penetrated the German lines. You see. So when they came, when the battle started, and the Rangers erupted out of the ditch. My friend Carl, he said, you know, I was firing my M1 from the hip, running through the German position, but the Germans basically, they kind of, in a sense, closed the bag behind them, and so they were trapped. And then most of the men, I believe, they fired till they ran out of ammunition, and then that battle was done, because you can't really hold out with no ammunition against tanks. So, and the 4th Ranger Battalion and other elements were fighting to try to you know, break a hole in the German line, but they couldn't do it because the German forces were so strong at that point, it couldn't be done. So that was the end of that.
Next question's going to stay to your right, towards the front.
Was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team part of the Special Forces?
The 442, the 100th Battalion, the 442, the Nisei unit, they were not. There was a moment, and I'd have to go back and look at the exact dates. I think they had been attached variously to the 1st Special Service Force, but they were never. It was only fleeting, and they weren't considered a special operations unit, but they certainly were a unit that had great esprit, and they acquitted themselves extremely well during World War II.
Next question is going to be to your right, right in the middle of the row. That's going to take me a while to get to.
Do you have an opinion that would have been a better location than Anzio for the invasion of Italy?
Well, there are a lot of armchair quarterbacks. So the problem was that General Mark Clark was very aggressive. He's one of the youngest generals. My uncle did not like him at all. He blamed him for the fiasco and for the capture of men that he had trained with and knew and loved. So he blamed Mark Clark. He believed Mark Clark would have done anything, and it's just an opinion, to get into Rome, and he sacrificed a lot of troops. Whether going into Anzio was the right thing or not, American troops were being chewed up down at Cassino. They were trying to proceed north up the boot of Rome, and as they advanced, the Germans would build one delaying position after the other, and the Americans would knock out one, and then there would be another, and then another. And casualties were extreme, and not too many people realize how many casualties we actually had. Thousands and thousands. You know, we know about Normandy, but they just don't realize the extreme casualties that we had in that Italy fight. So whether it was right or not, I don't know, but they were trying desperately to capture Rome, and Mark Clark wanted to capture Rome before Normandy. He wanted it so bad he could taste it. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and I do believe that, for instance, in the Sicily campaign, amphibious end runs had happened a number of times successfully, so I think they believed that this could be pulled off yet again. But again, it was a miscalculation, and I frankly don't know that much about him. But Albert Kesselring, the German commander in the area, he has the reputation of being a tremendous battlefield general in the defense, and so they had rushed so many forces so quickly, I think it caught the Allied planners by surprise, frankly. They had moved people from across the Adriatic, from all parts of other parts of Italy in the north, to rush them to surround the beachhead. So yeah, I think it caught everyone by surprise, frankly.
I think the other piece with Anzio is, it sounded like your question should have been deeper up
Other
the peninsula.
places. Yeah, I'm sorry.
You know, the challenge you have is that
Air.
you have a lot of short-range fighters, and you really are trying to make sure the beachhead is under, fighter cover, whereas farther north might have been bolder, but the chance of reinforcing it. And then ultimately, Pete will love this, the logistics, they're really not in place to continue the attack out of Anzio. And so the initial assault literally culminates there and sits there. And so I think, the logistician part, the buildup really allows the Germans to counterattack very effectively and almost eliminate the value of Anzio itself, I think.
Yeah.
I guess just one more thing. There were not many places along that western Italian coastline where you could attack, and Anzio was one of those that had the beach where you could actually attack. So that had a lot to do with where they went in. They had to be able to get ashore.
Next question's with Connie to your right, about halfway back, gentlemen.
Thank you for both presentations. I'd like to come back to Husky and in particular the 1st Infantry Division's difficult battle at Troina. Ultra intelligence had indicated that the San Fratello line, the Etna line, was going to be fortified a good 2 weeks before that battle, and in fact Troina was specifically mentioned as one of the place names in that defensive line. The 1st Infantry Division, of course, did not have access to Ultra. It only went down to Army level. They had assessed based on aerial reconnaissance that Troina was not occupied, that it was the Germans had passed through. Is there a role for these special forces that perhaps was overlooked in perhaps finding out where the probing where the German lines actually were? Thank you.
I would say the 1st Special Service Force, I could never find documents to confirm this, but from a guy named Herb Pepard, who was a Canadian forceman, in his book, The Lighthearted Soldier, he was a nice man. He claimed that he had gone to a local airfield bordered a C-47 with radios and parachutes and so forth, and that he had dropped, or he had been sent with the idea of dropping behind the German lines to report on German activity. This was during the Anzio campaign, I think prior to the breakout, prior to Operation Buffalo, and then they returned because they couldn't find the drop zone or some sort of thing like that. So yeah, I would say yes, that certainly would have been a mission, probably though for a smaller force. And that's where units like the OSS, they had the Special Reconnaissance Battalions that were operating out of North Africa because they had companies A, B, and C who were operating in the Mediterranean to do this sort of work, to be parachuted into the field to report back. So I think that activity was probably happening. The Special Service Force was a large formation, so they would have attracted, I think, a lot of attention had they been dropped. A unit like that, so they probably would have been better used as something like typical airborne forces to capture an objective ahead of an advance, close but near proximity. If that makes sense.
Next question is in the front row to your left, please.
Mr. Ross.
Yes.
I came in contact with a group in Montana that continues the special forces. They have a private, anybody in the Army Special Forces joins there, and so I've come in contact with one. They mentioned a couple of books, so I've read a couple of books. Now, one of the books, when you were talking about taking out the hydroelectric plants in Norway, it said that Churchill was really enthusiastic about special operations like this.
Sure.
And that he really liked this plan. And he had, when they got it set up, he was going to tell the Norwegian king and his son and their chief of staff and so on at a dinner that they were going to do this and take out all these electric plants. And when the Norwegians heard about it, they were gobsmacked. They could not believe. They said that if you do this, you will freeze Norway. You will kill thousands of civilians, and that was why it was stopped. Now I don't know. I've never been able to confirm that story, but it was in one of these books about the First Special Forces.
Yeah. And I don't know, the reports from the Norwegian government to that extent, but that was in the original history of the First Special Service Force that was published in 1947 by Robert Burhans, who was the force intelligence officer. That's where this information, that's where I obtained that information from. So I haven't seen any information from a Norwegian government source talking to that. But again, it wouldn't surprise me if that's how Churchill might want to open the conversation with them. But I do believe they were probably in planning, in serious planning with other officials within the Norwegian government and the military in exile to propose this. I feel like the Special Service Force, the big idea came, right? We're gonna have this force and we're gonna do these things. But as planning progressed, more problems came up that couldn't be overcome, and so they kind of, in a sense, backed out of it over and over again. So they backed out of Ploiesti, they backed out of going to northern Italy because there were probably other means to reach the objective, to reach the result at a lower cost. And they were talking about in Norway, they were having the Special Service Force was having a difficult time working with the powers that be in Britain, who controlled the large aircraft that they would need to transport by air and parachute their T-15 Weasels. And the British government wouldn't give them the aircraft. They wouldn't commit because they said, well, gosh, bombing will do more, so why allocate the resource to you? And there were a number of factors that all at once just basically collapsed the idea. And so, but what they had was 2,000 men who were aggressive combat troops, and they wanted to find a way to use them. So I don't know if that answered your question exactly, but.
One follow-up.
Yes, sir.
Let me bring the mic to you, Bob, real quick.
Do I have his knife?
The knife he designed.
Do I have a V-42 stiletto? No, I don't own one. They're hard to find. There is one here in the museum. I was happy to see, and I'll make a comment about that. There's a lot of talk about the First Special Service Force being these stealthy wraiths that glided through the night, slitting enemy throats. And as one man said, you don't find these knives on the loose really unless the blades have been ground down or the tips broken off. Because he said they opened a lot more cans of sea rations than they ever cut enemy throats. Anyway, although it did happen.
One quick one. I have my Uncle Fairborn Sykes knife. He came on home on a hospital ship from Italy, and he had some guns and swords, and he knew they would steal them because he was a patient. So the captain of the ship said, Captain Lyon, you got to turn your knife in, and he taped it to his body. He said, we're gonna court-martial you. He said, go ahead. I have the knife.
Oh.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Round of applause. Todd Ross, David Williams, and Mike Bell. It is now, before everybody gets up for the lunch break, a couple of important announcements. I mentioned this morning we had a change in schedule, one of which was Dr. Bell filling in for Dr. Millett as chair for this session. Another is that, unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond anyone's control, James Holland was unable to make it from the United Kingdom here to our lovely country. Tonight's program, for those of you that did purchased this additional program, An Evening with James Holland. You are now in for a treat and an evening with John McManus. I will give you more information about that at the close of the day. If you're interested in purchasing that after tonight's opening lecture, you can see our travel table, our info table for more information about that. Now, please join the gentleman outside at the retail station and the book signing. And it is lunch. You have the option of a chicken Caesar salad or a turkey sandwich, and we do have some vegetarian options. Please be back at 1:30 for our next session. Thank you.